of Arab students about 30 years back who followed the advice of the Quran, which says, "Fas'alu ahli zikri in kuntum la ta'lamun." In Surah Nahl chapter 16 verse 43 and Surah Anbiya chapter number 21 verse number 7, which says that if you are in doubt, ask the person who is knowledgeable. So they collected all the material and all the data given in the Quran and the authentic hadith dealing with embryology, and they presented it to Professor Keith Moore. At that time, in the early 1980s and the late 1970s, Professor Keith Moore was one of the highest authorities in the field of embryology. He was head of the Department of Anatomy in the University of Toronto in Canada. And they translated all these verses of the Quran and the Hadith and presented to him and asked him for his comments. He said that most of the things mentioned in the Quran are in perfect conformity with modern embryology. But there are a few things which I cannot say that they are right. Neither can I say they are wrong because I myself don't know about it. And one such thing is the first two verses of the Quran. Surah Iqra, Surah Alaq, chapter 96, verse number 1 and 2, which says, "Iqra bismi rabbikal ladzi khalaq. Khalaqal insana min alaq." Read, recite, proclaim in the name of thy Lord who created the human beings from something which clings, a leech-like substance. So Professor Keith Moore said, I do not know whether the embryo in the initial stages looks like a leech or not. So he went in the laboratory and under a very powerful microscope observed the early stages of an embryology, the early stages of an embryo, and compared it with the photograph of a leech. And he was astonished at the striking resemblance. And later on, when a variety question was asked him regarding embryology from Quran and Hadith, he told him, it's in early part of 1980s, about 30 years back, he said that if you would have asked me these questions 30 years before, I would not be able to answer more than 50% because embryology is a branch of medicine which I developed recently. And he said, I have got no objection in agreeing that this book is divine and Prophet Muhammad is the messenger. The Quran says in Surah Tariq, chapter 86, verse number 5 to 7, does not man think from what is created? Does not man know from what is created? He is created from a drop, emitted from a space between the backbone and the ribs. What does the Quran mean by saying that human beings have been created from a drop, emitted between the backbone and the ribs? Today, after science is advanced and embryology is advanced, we have come to know that the genital organs in the human beings, the testicles in the males and the ovaries in the females, in the embryonic life, when the child is in the womb of the mother, it originates from a space from where the kidney is present, between the backbones and the 11th and 12th rib. Later on, it descends down. In the female, the ovary goes to the true pelvis, and in the male, it descends down lower through the inguinal canal into the scrotum. But even in the adult life, after the ovaries and testicles have descended, yet they receive the blood supply and the nerve supply from the same space from where the kidney is present, between the backbone and the 11th and 12th rib. The blood supply comes from the aorta, which is present between the backbone and the 11th and 12th rib. And even the venous return and the lymphatic drainage goes back to the same area between the backbone and the 11th and 12th rib. Quran says in Surah Mu'minun chapter number 23, verse number 13, as well as Surah Hajj chapter 22, verse number 5. We have created the human beings from a nutfa. A nutfa means a minute quantity of liquid, a very small quantity. The Quran says in Surah Sajda chapter number 32, verse number 8, we have created the human beings from sulala. Sulala means the best part of the whole. Today science tells us, in one emission normally, in one ejaculation, a normal man emits about 300 million sperms. And out of 300 million sperms, only one is sufficient to fertilize the ova. This minute quantity is called as a nutfa. It is even called as sulala, the best part of the whole. One out of 300 million sperms, the Quran refers to as sulala. the best part of the whole. The Quran further says in Surah Insan, chapter 76, verse number 2, that we have created the human being from nutfatin amshaj, a mingled quantity, a minute quantity of mingled fluids. Today science tells us that both the fluids are required, the male and the female. The spermatozoa as well as ovum is required. And besides that, the other fluids secreted from the testicles, from the seminal vesicle, from the prostatic glands, from the glands of the ureter, all these fluids also help in the production of the child. Quran says a minute quantity of mingled fluid. In the field of genetics, today science tells us that the 23rd pair of chromosomes is responsible for the sex of the child. If it's XX, it's the female. If it's XY, it's the male. And today science tells us that it is the male fluid, it is the sperm which is responsible for deciding the sex of the child. If the X of the sperm takes part in fertilization, a female is born. If Y takes part, a male is born. This was discovered recently in science, 50 years back, 100 years back. Quran mentions 14 years ago in Surah Najm, chapter 53, verse number 45 and 46, that it is He who has created the human being from a minute quantity of liquid ejaculated from a male and gave it sex, male and female. The Arabic word is nutfa, minute quantity of liquid, and the Arabic word is tumna, ejaculated from a male. And then it got sex as male and female. The Quran repeats the message in Surah Qiyamah, chapter number 75, verse number 37 to 39, that we have created the human beings from a minute quantity of sperm, nutfatin mani yumna, a minute quantity of sperm. Then we made it into an alaqa, then made it into a mudga and gave it sex, male and female. The Quran says the sperm is responsible for the sex of the child, male and female. The country where I come from, India, people normally prefer having sons rather than daughters for reasons known best to them. And many a times, if a lady gives birth to a female child, the mother-in-law will blame the daughter-in-law. Why did you give birth to a female child? Actually, it depends upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala whether male is born or female is born. But if the mother-in-law has to blame anyone, she should not blame the daughter-in-law, she should blame the son. Because according to the Quran and according to science, it is the male which is responsible for the sex of the child and not the female. Furthermore, the Quran says in Surah Az-Zumar, chapter 39, verse number 6, that we have created the human beings in the womb of the mother in stages, one after the other, in 3 waves of darkness. Prophet Keith Moore said, these 3 waves of darkness which the Quran speaks about refers to the anti-abdominal wall, refers to the uterine wall and amniochorionic membrane. At that time, embryology, we did not know in embryology that the child, the embryo, is protected in 3 waves of darkness. Quran mentioned this 14 years ago. Furthermore, Quran speaks about the various embryological stages in great detail. In Surah Al-Mu'minun, chapter number 23, verse number 12 to 14. Quran says, we have created the human beings from a minute quantity of liquid. Then made it in, and then placed it into a qararim makin, a place of security. Then made it into an alaqa, a leech-like substance. Then made the alaqa into a mudga, a chewed-like lump. Then made the mudga into izama, bones. Then clothed the izama with lahm, flesh. Glory be to Allah, who's the best to create. These 3 verses of the Quran speaks about the various embryological stages in great detail. It says, we have created the human beings from a nutfa, which I told you earlier, means a minute quantity of liquid, then placed it into a qararim makin, a place of security. Today science tells us that the baby, the embryo, is protected posteriorly from the spinal cord and the posterior muscles, and anteriorly by the anterior abdominal wall, as well as the uterine wall, as well as the amniochorionic membrane. It says, then we made it into an alaqa, a leech-like substance. The Arabic word alaqa has got 3 meanings. One means a leech-like substance, which we discussed earlier. It also means something which clings, and we know that the embryo clings to the uterine wall. And the third meaning is a congealed clot of blood. Today science tells us, in the initial stages, the blood does not circulate in the embryo, and it also looks like a congealed clot. So imagine all three meanings of alaqa: a leech-like substance, something which clings, a congealed clot. All three, according to science today, is perfect. Alhamdulillah. Furthermore, it says, we made the alaqa into a mudga, a chewed-like lump. Prophet Keithmore took plasticine and bit it between his teeth to resemble a mudga, a chewed-like lump. And the teeth marks, they resemble the somites, from where the nerves develop in a human being. We made the mudga into izama, that is bones. Then clothed the bones with lahm, that is flesh. Then the Quran says, glory be to him who's the best to create. Today science tells us up to this stage, the development in the embryo is the same, whether it be a fish, whether it be rabbit, whether other animals. Only after this stage, it differs. And in a human being, we find the head coming out, feet, legs. That's the reason the Quran says, then he created a new creature. Glory be to him who's the best to create. Quran says in Surah Hajj chapter 22 verse number 5, that we create the human being from minute quantity of liquid, then made it into an alaqa, made the alaqa into mudga, partly formed and partly unformed. When Professor Marshall Johnson was told to comment on this verse of the Quran, he said at this stage of the human development, some organs in the human being are formed, some are not formed. Some cells are differentiated, some are undifferentiated. If I call at this stage as a complete creation, the answer is wrong. Because it's not a complete creation. If I say it's an incomplete creation, again the answer is wrong. There is no better description than the description of the Quran, saying it's partly formed and partly unformed. Because some organs are complete, some are incomplete. Some cells are differentiated, some are undifferentiated. And Professor Keithmore said, the stages given in the Quran of alaqa, mudga, izaman, it is based on shapes of the embryo. It is far superior than the stages of modern embryology, where we say stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, where a person can get confused. The stages described in the Quran based on shapes and figures is far superior and easier. All these things, what science has discovered recently, 30 years back, 40 years back, 50 years back, 100 years back, was mentioned in the Quran 1400 years ago. Time will not